Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Today, we're heading to Washington, D.C. on December 2nd, 1823, the day President James Monroe stood before Congress and announced a policy that would echo through American foreign relations for the next 2 centuries. And here's what fascinates me about this moment. Monroe made a declaration that America didn't actually have the power to enforce. But it worked anyway. And understanding why it worked and what it became tells us everything about how power actually functions in the world. Picture this. It's December 2nd, 1823, and President James Monroe is delivering his annual message to Congress. Buried deep in that speech, and I mean buried, not some dramatic headline moment, is a statement that will reshape the Western Hemisphere. Monroe essentially tells the European powers, the Americas are closed for colonization. You stay out of our hemisphere, and we'll stay out of yours. Now here's the thing that I always wonder about. Did Monroe realize in that moment how bold, how audacious this declaration really was? America in 1823 couldn't back up those words with anything resembling real military power. We had a tiny army, a modest navy, and absolutely no ability to stop a European power from doing whatever it wanted in Latin America. And yet Monroe drew the line anyway. Let me build the clock for you, because understanding why this policy was created and how it actually worked reveals something profound about the nature of power and influence. Think about it this way. In 1823, Latin America was going through its own revolution. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, all these former Spanish colonies were declaring independence. Spain was collapsing as an empire. And in Europe, the old monarchies, the ones who'd survived Napoleon, were looking at all this revolutionary activity and getting nervous. There was serious talk about European intervention to restore monarchical control in the Americas. Here's what the evidence tells us. Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who really wrote most of this doctrine, saw an opportunity and a threat. The opportunity was to establish American influence in a newly independent Latin America. The threat was that if European powers recolonized the Americas, the United States would be surrounded by potentially hostile monarchies instead of friendly republics. But here's where it gets interesting. America couldn't actually do anything about European intervention. If France, Spain, or Russia decided to send fleets to reconquer South America, the United States Navy couldn't stop them. So why make this bold declaration? The answer reveals something fascinating about how power works. Monroe and Adams understood something that people often miss. Sometimes the declaration itself is the power. Sometimes saying something out loud, clearly and publicly, changes the game even if you can't enforce it with military might. But there's more to the story, and this is where my investigator's instinct kicks in. Because what Monroe said publicly and what actually made the policy work aren't quite the same thing. The real muscle behind the Monroe Doctrine wasn't American power at all. It was British power. Britain at that moment was the world's dominant naval force. And Britain had its own reasons for keeping European powers out of Latin America. They wanted to trade with those newly independent states, not see them reconquered by rival European powers. So here's what actually happened. Monroe made the declaration. The British quietly let it be known that they agreed. And suddenly, any European power thinking about intervention had to consider that they'd be facing not just America's words, but Britain's navy. I find myself thinking about the brilliance of this arrangement. Monroe got to look strong and establish American leadership in the hemisphere. Britain got what it wanted without publicly saying it was supporting this upstart former colony. And the European powers backed down, not because America could stop them, but because the system, the machinery of power and interest, intervened more trouble than it was worth. Think about the position Monroe and Adams were in. They knew America was weak militarily. They knew they were making a claim they couldn't enforce on their own. But they also understood that if they didn't make the claim, European powers would simply return to the Western Hemisphere and America would be hemmed in, its future growth constrained, its security threatened. So they bluffed. Or rather, they made a calculated bet that Britain's interests would align with America's words. And they were right. Now here's where the story gets more complicated and more relevant to today. The Monroe Doctrine started as a defensive policy, keep Europe out. But over the decades, it evolved into something else, justification for American intervention throughout Latin America. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, presidents were using the Monroe Doctrine to justify American military intervention in Caribbean and Central American countries. We weren't just keeping Europe out. We were going in. Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Panama, the list goes on. The policy that began as stay out of our hemisphere became we get to decide what happens in this hemisphere. I always wonder if Monroe and Adams would recognize what their doctrine became. Because here's the thing, they were solving one immediate problem, European recolonization, but they were creating the framework for a different problem, one we're still wrestling with today. We're still living with versions of the Monroe Doctrine, and I think this is where the story gets especially relevant for us right now. Look at our current foreign policy debates. When we talk about spheres of influence, we're really talking about modern versions of the Monroe Doctrine. When Russia claims Ukraine is in its sphere of influence, they're essentially making a Monroe Doctrine argument. This is our region, stay out. When China claims the South China Sea, same thing. When the United States objects to Russian or Chinese influence in Latin America, we're invoking, explicitly or implicitly, Monroe's 1823 principle. And here's what fascinates me. We defend our sphere of influence while objecting to everyone else's. We think our Monroe Doctrine is reasonable, while theirs is aggressive. Both sides believe they have legitimate security interests. Both sides believe their neighbors' choices affect their safety. Both sides claim they're just maintaining regional stability. The pattern repeats. The question repeats. Does proximity give you special rights over your neighbor's choices? Here's what the evidence from 1823 tells us. Monroe Doctrine-style policies work when other powers allow them to work, either because they share interests or because they lack the will to challenge them. They don't work because they're morally right or legally justified. They work because of the underlying power dynamics. Think about what this means. When we criticize Russia's actions in its near abroad, Ukraine, Georgia, the former Soviet states, while simultaneously intervening in Central and South America, we're asking others to accept a standard we don't follow ourselves. When China builds naval bases and claims territorial waters, they're doing exactly what we did as we rose to power, expanding influence in their region. I find myself thinking about this a lot lately, because the uncomfortable truth is that the Monroe Doctrine taught the world a lesson about power. And now other rising powers have learned that lesson and are applying it themselves. But here's what troubles me. If we don't accept that other powers will claim their own spheres of influence, we're headed for constant conflict. But if we do accept it, what happens to the sovereignty of smaller nations caught in those spheres? Georgia doesn't want to be in Russia's sphere any more than Nicaragua wanted to be in America's. Do we say, that's just how power works? Or do we defend the principle that nations should be free to choose their own path? These aren't abstract questions. They're the questions driving conflicts right now. They're the questions that will shape whether we stumble into wars or find ways to coexist. Look at Latin America today. Many countries still resent the Monroe Doctrine and everything it became. They remember the interventions, the coups we supported, the times we prioritized our interests over their sovereignty. When we talk about competing with Chinese influence in Latin America now, they hear echoes of Monroe, our hemisphere, our rules. And here's the thing, we can't claim special rights in our hemisphere while denying others the same claim in theirs. Well, we can claim it, but we can't expect others to accept it as legitimate. That's the contradiction at the heart of sphere of influence politics. So as we think about that December day in 1823, when Monroe made his declaration, I think the question for us isn't whether the Monroe Doctrine was right or wrong. The question is more complicated. What do we do with the world that doctrine helped create? We live in a world where every significant power wants its own Monroe Doctrine. Russia wants Eastern Europe. China wants East Asia. America wants to maintain its traditional influence in the Western Hemisphere while also projecting power globally. These desires conflict. These spheres overlap. And in the overlapping spaces, you find Ukraine, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Middle East. The machinery Monroe built, the idea that proximity gives you special influence, that machinery is still running, but now everyone wants to operate it. And the question isn't whether the machinery exists, it's whether we can operate it without colliding. I always come back to this. Monroe's declaration worked because Britain let it work. It succeeded not through American power alone, but through a convergence of interests between rising and established powers. There was accommodation, there was pragmatism, there was a recognition that sometimes you let others have what they claim because the alternative is worse. Maybe that's the real lesson of the Monroe Doctrine. Not that we should claim spheres of influence, but that when multiple powers make those claims, we need the wisdom to find accommodation. We need to recognize that other nations have security interests, even when we don't like how they define them. We need to find ways to protect small nations' sovereignty, while acknowledging that great powers will always worry about their borders. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And here's why that matters today. We're watching nations claim their own Monroe doctrines while forgetting what made ours work. Not moral superiority, but pragmatic accommodation with other powers. If we can't remember that lesson, we'll keep colliding over spheres of influence instead of finding ways to coexist. The question isn't whether we'll have these tensions, we will. The question is whether we'll be wise enough to manage them without catastrophe. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, think about what it means when everyone wants their own sphere of influence. Because that's the world Monroe helped create on this day in 1823, and it's the world we're still trying to navigate today. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history on the Daily History Chronicle.